My guest today again is Chris Morrison. It's been about 2 years, I think, since Chris was on here. And Chris, what's new?
Oh, well, thanks for calling me back. I'm honoured to be in the. I know you've had many eminent scientists who come on more than once, so I am honoured. Particularly since as you know, I'm a student of science, not a scientist. I'm a journalist by training, by profession, and a publisher, and I spent a lifetime, as a journalist, but a financial journalist. So this, as I said to you 2 years ago, I'd been working on the Daily Sceptic, which is an online publication here in the United Kingdom. I told you I've been working for a year or so, and I think I told you it was an Indian summer to an extent because I've had a career elsewhere and sold the company and all that sort of stuff. And still doing it, because it is a great deal of fun. And what has changed dramatically in the last 2 years is that even a couple of years ago, the Daily Sceptic very briefly started as Lockdown Skeptic. It started as a blog from a very eminent, well-known journalist, Toby Young, here in the UK, and it really sort of took the skeptical side of all the COVID hysteria. And Toby came to the point where COVID, the lockdowns eased, and he was going to keep it up as a sort of historical blog because he had a lot of medical information that was kept out of the mainstream media. He's going to keep it up, but then he decided, it had this enormous circulation. It was really very, very large, couple of million hits of the internet a month or so. And so he decided to morph it into the Daily Skeptic and cover woke, still medical stuff, and net zero. And I came along at that time, and I pretty well had that subject to myself. They were still doing other things, well, they still are. And I could pick up all these stories, and as I think I told you before, my interest in it was that coming to it as a journalist, I came across this field where there were all these fantastic stories as an investigative journalist, as all journalists should be, an investigatively inquiring journalist. They're all being sort of, traduced or written or ignored by the mainstream media, or just ignored, under the settled science narrative. And so you'd look at coral reefs, and they would tell you that they're all disappearing, and then you'd look at the figures and find that it's all at record growths and all this sort of stuff, the polar bears and the ice, and so for a journalist, it just struck me as a great field of great stories. And so in the early days, I could almost sort of have a runway. I could keep, oh, that's interesting, I'll do that. I got two more stories to write before then. Not anymore, not anymore. There's everybody and his wife is now, or his husband or her husband is now writing about net zero and climate change. It's really soared up to the top of the pile, and so all these stories I could have sat on, I now have to sort of work even slightly harder, and that's not a problem. I mean, we all like competition. We're not communists. We like free enterprise and competition. But I would say that well over half now of the Daily Skeptic's work is net zero climate related, and I still take an interest very much in the science because I've always held that if there is an existential crisis and we have to remove hydrocarbons, which will probably take us to somewhere around the beginning of the industrial age, we have to do it. So therefore, I cover in particular a lot of the science and to see if there is an existential crisis. My impression as a student of science, but a person who's read a lot of science papers, certainly all the stuff the IPC has written, is that there is not an existential crisis. What there is a political crisis. There's a made-up crisis for purely political ends. And so, there's been a lot to write about in the last 2 years. And I've focused. The demise of the fact checkers is a great disappointment to me. This is disappointing because I remember a couple of years ago when I first started getting fact checked, because we get fact checked all the time, and I remember it was some quite distinguished. I say distinguished, yeah, someone like Reuters or Agency France Press or some Press France or whatever they're called. Um, and I thought, oh my goodness, it's a fact check, I haven't got something wrong. So I read the first one and I thought, but there's nothing wrong with it. It's just an opinion. And we've had countless ones since then. And we've had the usual thing they do is they put up a straw man. So they say that the Daily Sceptic is misleading. And then they quote something that somebody's written on social media, which is different from what we've written. And then they check that. if they can find a fact wrong in it, and then they say that we're misleading. And so they put up straw men, they misread, they do all sorts of things. And I can say hand on heart, I can honestly say hand on heart, that of all the fact checks I've seen, they've never ever pointed to a single fact that's wrong. Now, that's not to say, I'm infallible. Of course I'm not. But we do check this stuff, and we source it very heavily, because we source it because that's where we got it from in the first place. So it's not a problem in sourcing where we get the information from. We're careful how we write it. We don't go down conspiracy theory rabbit holes unless it is a conspiracy of some sort. And we've got the facts. But of course, what it means is we get great copy, because every time one of these fact checkers, and there could be anybody, Reuters, all sorts of people, the BBC fact checked us once we're in the program. It's great copy because you can write about, yet another inept fact check. And there was one that, again, from Agency France Press, where we said, where I forget exactly what he did. They did something. I think again they simply checked something else that we hadn't written, and then we talked about it being a new low in fact checking that will probably be studied in journalism school in future years, of how not to do a fact check. But they're all ghastly, as you know, and so we get quite a lot of fun by debunking the fact checkers. So it seems as if that might be going. But the last one, of course, was the climate feedback one, and they've done one on the all our work, which we've done, which I've been quite a lot concerned with this year, on the UK Met Office. The UK Met Office's surface temperature network, and they recently did one, and the Met Office, for some inexplicable reason, don't return my calls anymore. We only communicate through Freedom of Information Act requests. But they did provide a complete lowdown of, what, their defense, if you like, in this climate feedback report, which we've just published on the Daily Sceptic. For the last year, as I say, we've been investigating it. We started really last March, where we did a Freedom of Information Act, and we asked for the World Meteorological Organization classes that regulate or give indications of weather temperature sites. And as I'm sure you and I'm sure many of the listeners will know, they rate it from 1 to 5. 1 is pristine, and 5 is simply junk. And classes 4, classes 5 have uncertainties, as they call them, of 2 centigrade and 5 centigrade respectively. I mean, class 5 is real junk. They don't even put any, they put a lot of sort of, qualifications on how they rate them, how near they are to heat sources and this sort of thing. And class 5 is you could put it next to the door of a blast furnace, and you can still call it class 5. So we got that, and I was slightly surprised. They came back, and we had a list of all of their weather stations, 383, with the classes. And that opened a Pandora's box, because once obviously we suspect it, because you can look at the Google Maps and the coordinates. You can see how crowded they are with all sorts of car parks and electricity substations, and somewhere in the middle of solar farms and all sorts of places, where obviously the heat corruption is enormous. Once you have that information, you can then go on to sort of work out a lot of other things. You can work out where the records are coming from. And of course, they all tend to come from class 5 and class 4. And it opens up a huge field of inquiry. And we've been doing this now since last March. It opens up fields of, I should add, there's another a chap who's a great citizen sleuth, Ray Sanders, who does a lot of this work on the what's called the Tall Boy Talk Shop. I'm more than happy to give him a shout out. And of course, there's the
tall bloke. I'm sorry, tall bloke, right? Is it tall bloke?
It's called Tall Bloke.
Yeah.
Talk Shop.
Yes.
I think is the actual name. Yeah. Ray Sanders. And there's the redoubtable Paul Homewood, who I'm sure most people are aware of, who runs the. Not a lot of people know that site. He's done a huge amount of work over the years on this Met thing, Met Office, and so we can look at. So Ray Sanders took it further. He discovered that the Met Office had 103 non-existent weather stations. These are weather stations reporting temperature data that don't actually exist anymore. And I know you've had the same in the United States with Anthony Watts' great work, where he discovered these ghost stations, where these stations close, and where and the reason they give is they say, well, if we've got 20, 30 years data, it's a shame not to sort of keep it going. So they estimated They got into trouble, I think, where we were able to say they were non-existent is that under their station locations, you type in something on their website, the station, and it comes up with the station and it gives you the coordinates and all that sort of thing. And then it gives you a 30-year rolling average data record of the temperature. And then you put in the coordinates, and there was one for Dover Beach that I put in that was right on the edge of the shore. I mean, it doesn't exist. And Ray lives in Kent, and he went to a number of these so-called stations that the Met Office was saying they were providing data for. Dungeness, Folkestone, Dover, and again he found they simply didn't exist at the location, and they were either had been in existence years ago, or whatever, but they were still estimating data. And then, of course, they say, well, and this came up in the fact check recently. They then say, well, we do that because we don't want to lose the data, and they now hastily changed from station to location specific, so they've muddied it to suggest that it's a wider area. So they say that scientifically, it's all been peer reviewed. They now look at it. They look at well-connected stations nearby. So again, the redoubtable Sanders was on the job, and he typed in Kaywood. Now, Kaywood, he typed in this location station, sort of, to get a 30-year rolling average. Kaywood is a Class 1 site. That means that it has, according to the WMO, it's pristine. It can give you a good temperature for a wide area of land surrounding it, unlike, say, a runway, which gives you a good guide of what the temperature is on the runway when a jet goes by. So the Class 1, brilliant. Now, Kaywood is also interesting because it has a very good record, no days missed or anything, going back to 1959. So it would therefore give you a 60-year, 30-year rolling average. You look up Kaywood, and there's no record. So you'd think that if you put in Kaywood, if they had that data, what they do is they then give you 5 other stations. And this, you can go there today and see it. 5 other stations where there are apparently record temperature data to be had. 4 of those have closed. 4 of them have actually closed. And I think one of them was only open for about 20 years. And the 5th one is 27 miles away. It's still open, and it's at a higher elevation of 163 meters. So on that basis, 4 close stations with up to 27 miles away, and one that's much, much higher, they're going to give you the average location temperature for Kaywood, even though it seems they have the data for Kaywood, which would do the job perfectly well without taking the 5 stations. Now, you wonder why they're doing this. Now, on the Daily Sceptic, we don't go down conspiracy rabbit holes. We only look at conspiracies when there is a conspiracy. And I'm not saying that there is a conspiracy here, but there may be a narrative that's being formed. They have a database that is perfectly okay. The problem with Kaywood is that if you're a conspiracy theorist at all, is that it's going to give you a very accurate reading, but it's also done by manual thermometers, which tend not to pick up every gust of wind or blow of jet exhaust. So maybe they're saying, oh no, it's a manual one and whatever, And we all know that manual temperatures were very accurate, providing the person who had it has got good eyesight and does it properly. And Kaywood seems to be that. Maybe they're saying that. Or maybe, I don't know. I mean, maybe they just think, well, that's going to give us too accurate a temperature. Surely not. I mean, this is a major scientific, well-regarded. I have a lot of regard for the Met Office. I think they do a fantastic job, say, on weather forecasting. But I have less of a regard for them when they, when there's always an activist cell working within the Met Office to promote this net zero fantasy. They're colouring their weather maps, purple whenever the temperature goes above, sort of 78 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever, and all this stuff they get up to, and naming storms and, issuing all these warnings. It's going to be a heat wave today. It's 25 degrees centigrade in Cornwall, and all this sort of stuff. So they are really, really heavily in on the net zero narrative. One has to start asking questions. You have got a very ropey website. Oh, I should point out that when we found out about the classes 4 and 5, which have the uncertainties of 2 and 5 centigrade, we found out that 80% of all the Met Office sites were in class 4 and class 5. There are only about 27 classes, I think, in class 1, They had very few in the pristine class. They had one less, actually, because Ray Sanders went down to Hastings, near where he lives again, and he found out that it was covered in overgrowth and all sorts of things. And so he wrote to them and said, oh, no, it's actually a class 4. But we always default to class 4, class 1, when we haven't checked it out or something, So they even got one less, due to, than Mr. Sanders. So they have very few really class 1, class 2, very, very small, 8 out of 10, as I said. So they're using, the more we look at their data, it's not really fit for the purpose they're using it for net zero. It's not fit, for instance, for them to tell us that in the UK, the temperature in 2023 was 0.06 degrees cooler than the temperature in 2022. You cannot use, in my view, such a sort of a poor web station network to tell us details down to 100th of a degree centigrade. It's ridiculous. When most of your weather stations are in junk classes, with these huge uncertainties. But of course, when the Met Office, and I say I have some respect for the Met Office because they do a fantastic job in providing forecasting, has got better because they can obviously see above the air now with the sky with satellites, and the computers are bigger, they can work it out. But where I think they come a cropper is using this information that is fairly, it's just not very accurate, but it's good enough for why it was set up in the first place. Because the Met Office was set up to give farmers an idea when the spring would come along and how warm it was in local areas. It didn't have to be that accurate. It was had military uses, all sorts of reasons. It didn't have to be that accurate. It didn't really matter. You didn't have to have this sort of precision. But now they can get this precision, and they're now using it in order to frighten, produce mass climate psychosis in general populations. The temperature is going up probably higher than it is. The temperature is going up, but it probably isn't going up quite as high as they say. And to give one example about the precision and the difference between, as I was talking about K-Woods, the manual, the old manual mercury thermometers, and the new automatic ones that use electric currents, don't they? We now have the national joke, as I call it, the national joke, which is our record temperature record. Set at 312 at very precision. I like the precision. 312 on July the 19th, 2022 at Pollersby, a record 40.3 centigrade, often referred to by the Met Office and the BBC and everyone else who likes to talk about this, horrendous record, we're all going to burn up, whatever. They tend to forget to use the full title of Conisbee, which is RAF Conisbee, which is a military airport, which is where a lot of their temperature measuring devices are set. And this was set halfway down the runway, and at 312. We looked at the figures preceding it and afterwards. The temperature spiked. It went up by 0.6 centigrade, 2 minutes and 1 minute before the 312 record. That record stood for 60 seconds, and then it went down by 0.6 centigrade. Now, I wonder what could cause that. Obviously, a very, very accurate temperature measuring device, but also we did a Freedom of Information Act, and we found that 3 Typhoon jets were attempting to land at the same time. So it seems quite possible that that particular accurate measuring device was affected by a gust of jet exhaust. And if you look at, as I say, the Pandora's box, which you can open by looking at all the classes, you will see that most of the records that they've set in the last 20, 25 years are all in these class 4, or most of them are in class 4 and class 5. And as Sanders is actually going through the whole database, the whole 383, and you can see the most horrendous heat corruptions all over. You can see them in the middle of solar farms. You can see them next to electricity substations. You can see them by car parks. You can see them by main roads. You can see a great number by airport runways. There was one picture of Aberdeen Dice Airport, which again, I think we published, and I've seen it elsewhere as well, is you can see the device by the runway, and you can see this enormous Airbus jet, which is turning, and its engines are literally blowing over the temperature device, creating another record, and we're all going to die, Armageddon, climate Armageddon. And what I find amazing about this is not a peep, not a single word of our work. And it's work. It's not just me doing it. I mean, I don't want to take all the credit. First of all, I've given a lot of credit to people like Homewood, who came long before me, and Sanders. But Anthony Watson, the States, and a lot of people. Joe Noga has looked at the Australian one. There's a lot of evidence now piling up that these records, whereas, as I say, they do a lot of good scientific work. These records, when they're used to promote the net zero fantasy, are simply junk. They're just junk. They shouldn't be used. If you want to have an accurate record and tell us exactly what the temperature is, you need to get a pristine set of temperatures from pristine class ones. The Met Office is funded hundreds of millions of pounds, by the state. You want to use some of that money in order to set up a proper one, as I think like NOAA has. NOAA set up this 147 site station, haven't they? In areas where not only is it pristine, but areas where they are fairly sure there'll be no corruption from human involvement in 50 years going forward. Now, you might not be able to do that in the UK. We obviously have a slightly more crowded island. But I think, unless you can do that, I'm sorry, you cannot use these figures for the political purposes which they're being used.
So it is amazing to me. You're talking about using this terrible data. It's getting so much publicity. And then I learned from one of your articles that in 2022, Roy Spencer's satellite page was demonetized by Google and AdSense because of it was unreliable and harmful claims. So you can't
That's
have
right.
that. It's a
That's right.
bizarre world. Yeah.
It's a bizarre world, and I think 2 years ago that was the great year of fact checkers and all this nonsense, demonetizing and all sorts of things. We don't get any ads. I mean, Daily Sceptic doesn't get any ads because we've given up. NewsGuard gives us some low rating and all that sort of snot nonsense. So we rely on subscriptions and selling it. But yeah, Roy Spencer's page was demonetized. This is the UAH satellite record. They didn't like the fact that it was, it was continuing to show the pause, the great pauses of 1998 to 2012 or so, and then there was a pause from 2016 that lasted 8 or 9 years. Now, the Met Office also showed the pause in their Hydrocarbons global data set, and they even wrote a paper called The Pause, where they tried to say it was all, forget what they actually said, the heat was hiding in the ocean or whatever they were saying at the time, whatever. And they wrote this, they wrote it. You can still see it online. But unfortunately, the Hydrocarbons, as we know, has had two, from Hydrocarbons 3 to Hydrocarbons 4 to Hydrocarbons 5, two updates, and each one added 15% extra warming to the recent global record. And the pause is no more. The pause is no more. So it was all rather inconvenient to still have the satellite record that still showed that there was a pause, you see. So obviously that's harmful information. I mean, even though I think we can generally agree that, that a lot of people are only too keen to quote satellite information. It's generally seen as probably the most accurate information we've had. It's been satellites have been this enormous boom to all of science, except it seems for temporary measurements. This is a mystery to me why this should be so, but although perhaps it's not that much of a mystery. Anyway, so Google, in their wisdom, abandoned it, kicked off AdSense, which is how we got a few ads, I think, from it. That decision looks more stupid by the day, because there has been a recent increase in a spike in the weather, in the temperature. We know that in the last couple of years. Many people have speculated, as indeed we've done. We tried to produce the scientific thinking on it. Why it occurred? We had 3 very weak El Niños, followed by a very strong El Niño. La Niñas, the weak ones, and then the strong El Niño, which historically has usually given a very big spike to temperatures. I think I remember a paper that looked at it, and a similar thing happened in 76 to 79, and the spike in 79 was even higher than the spike that they all sort of, went crazy Armageddon, like over the last couple of years or so. So it's been looking more stupid by the day, because he actually showed accurately in the UAH data. He showed quite accurately that there has been a spike, and it was very similar to the one that was recorded on some of the surface records. This is these are proper scientists. These were NASA scientists, him and John Christie in the University of Alabama. And, they were banned. The page was banned, for no reason that it was inconvenient. And I think that over the last 2 years, I've really sort of, seen all this occur. I've seen, the excesses, and I see a small unwinding. And for that, we must give praise to Donald Trump. Uh, Whatever people think of his, sort of persona, but he's certainly a guy. He's a guy, incidentally, when I was in business, I met many people like Donald Trump. They're businessmen, they're transactional. They tend not to be, see life as full of delusions, because you tend not to make very much money if you simply produce stuff that, you want to produce rather than the world does. Anyway, leaving aside Donald Trump, in that sense, there's suddenly all coming on board. A lot of the woke stuff, a lot of the climate nonsense is going to disappear under Trump. You've seen businesses, tearing up their, former affiliations. You've seen the, for environment, EDI, whatever they call it, or the EDI, and all these sorts of things. And you've seen, as I say, Zuckerman, knocking out his fact check. This is a chap who actually banned Trump in I think January 2020. Now sort of cozying up to the Donald. He's cozying up to Zuckerberg, and you see this sort of generally net zero is essentially dead on the world stage for the next 4 years. And if the Republican, if you like, revolution is successful, and and other Republican like Trump follows, is dead for a lot longer. We only really have, as far as I can see, the United Kingdom and Germany. We unfortunately got numbered due to a split vote in the right in July, with a practically Marxist Labour government, woke Marxist, socialist, whatever, net zero obsessed, driving all our industry away, and it's just terrible. But say the net zero thing is essentially dead. And I've seen over the last 2 years much more reality come into it. First of all, as I said earlier on, a lot more people are writing about it, and a lot more people are writing about it skeptically, because there's always been a lot of people writing about how we're all going to die and all that sort of stuff. A lot more people are writing about it skeptically. They're starting to say that net zero is starting to bite. People start to realize that they're after your cars, after your holidays, after your lifestyle, after your transport, after your meat, a whole lot. They're starting to realize that, and they're starting to question. And I think that I say I've seen in the last 2 years much more concentration on, is this a real problem? Is it necessary, and whatever? And as I say, I think that Donald Trump will essentially on the world stage will kill it. All this stuff about giving $300 million or $300 billion to sort of islands of the Pacific that are actually growing in size, and all this nonsense that they come up with, and all this social justice, and it's because we're all terrible people, or our ancestors kept slaves, and all that sort of stuff. Even though if you're a student of history, you'll know that the situation is slightly more complicated than that. That mankind has always kept slaves, and it was, you could argue, it was the British Navy that stopped a lot of it when it was the world power for a very short period. Anyway, but leaving that aside, so a lot of it is, I think, going to disappear, except in England. So I've got a son who married an American girl, lives near South Bend, and I've got 2 grandchildren, so I may well be immigrating. No, I know.
Really?
But I might consider it if it gets much worse here. If we're going to go, and I jest, net zero, I don't think we ought to be any sort of feeling about it. It's an existential crisis, a danger to humanity. I'm always amazed at how these people, they talk about, getting rid of hydrocarbons in fertilizers. I mean, this lunatic Labour government that we have is putting a 12% tax on imported fertilizers made from hydrocarbons. I mean, if you take hydrocarbons, and I'm sure you've heard this on your podcasts, many times, you take hydrocarbons out of the mix making fertilizers, you will cut world food supply probably by about a half. That means that half the world will starve. And after a while, half the world may well die. I mean, it's a death knell. And the idea that you can take hydrocarbons out of a modern industrial society is just for the birds. It's not just energy. It's not just the gas in cars and that sort of stuff. It's in everything. It's plastic. It's in it'll be easier to mention things that it isn't in a modern society, and yet these lunatics are driving. In this country, we can't frack for gas. We can't any longer have new licenses for oil and gas. We're totally reliant on these windmills, which in a period in December for about 4 weeks. Sorry, for about 4 or 5 days, produce no energy at all. But then the gas turbines kick in. But then if we're going to close them down in 5 years' time, it's a disaster. And people are starting to wake up. And as I say, I see it on the Daily Sceptic, which has really become very much a net zero a publication, or certainly a climate change, or certainly it's a major part of it. I see it all around. I see much more interest, as I said.
So you name some names, but can you name more names of people who are pushing back against the net zero thing? Any writers or that you want to point out that you like their work?
Ross Clark is very good. He writes for The Spectator. And of course, there's your brilliant film with Martin Durkin. He's a filmmaker. There's obviously which had its which I was privileged to attend its premiere in London, as you know, because you were there in Leicester Square. Full, absolute full theatre just off Leicester Square. I'm thinking of Paul Homewood has started writing for us. He not only writes for his not a lot of people know that he's writing for us now. A guy called David Turver, again another retiree. He was an engineer, and he writes a lot for us. He writes a lot on net zero, the figures, how they just don't add up. He's a great whiz with the figures. I mean, if anybody who looks at the figures, I mean, I try and put my head around them, and I've been on sort of similar podcasts and radio and TV stations, and they say, well, yeah, what's it going to cost? And I almost feel like saying, well, why don't I just invent a figure? I mean, that's what everybody else does. Or that's what all the people on the side promoting it do. They simply invent figures, very low figures, and you can look at these figures and you can see, there's 20 billion here, and there's 16 billion that consumers in this country alone pay on their electricity bill just for this, these wretched wind turbines and other, solar. You add that up, you add the capital cost, you add how much these windmills cost, you add up all sorts of things, and you get to hundreds of billions, and then you start to get to trillions. And then you start to think, well, actually, the gross national product of Britain is only about 3 trillion. I mean, and yet we're supposed to be spending all of our money, or not all of it, because it's obviously over a long period or over a period. And then you have carbon capture, and then you have money given, obviously, to people in the South Pacific whose islands are not sinking beneath the waves. And then you have all sorts of money going to people for social justice problems in, wherever they want to do it. I saw one in Mexico, where they were trying to persuade coffee growers to make coffee in a more sustainable way, and they were running diversity classes at the same time to all these sort of Mexican farm workers. I mean, it gets bizarre. So you add up all of this stuff, and you can almost invent a figure, because we just don't know, but we do know that the sum of money will be a very, very, very large sum of money, which will probably bankrupt us, and there's absolutely no need, particularly for to get rid of hydrocarbons, because, as I say, we might come on to this. I'm convinced, as a student of science, as a journalist now who's written about it for 3 or 4 years, I'm convinced that carbon dioxide is not a problem. It is not a problem. It is the gas of life. And there are a number of theories. There's obviously, you've had people like William Happer, who's a great proponent of the saturation theory, where the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere stops warming after a certain point because it saturates within very narrow bands of the infrared spectrum. The beauty of this particular hypothesis is that, the beauty is that the BBC ban it. So that's obviously, it's always worth looking again at anything they ban. But the beauty of it is that it explains most of the history, or all of the history of the going back 600 million years. It explains why carbon dioxide has been 15 times higher. It explains why there's no discernible link really between the ups and downs of CO2 and the ups and downs of temperature. It explains all of this in a way that human cause, anthropogenic hypothesis of carbon dioxide doesn't explain. And then we see this astonishing greening of the Earth, truly astonishing. Again, we've written about it quite a bit. There've been a number of papers recently where you've had huge areas going from Brazil across the southern Sahara and in the Sahel, Ethiopia, a lot of Asia, Western Australia, all in the tropics. You've seen this enormous greening over the last 20 years, a greening that's actually sort of getting more green. It's actually accelerating the greening. And this again, along with the use of hydrocarbon fertilizers, has led to a huge increase in food production. It's led, you could argue, when you look at where it's greened in Africa, it's led to a diminution of famine, which was the great fear of pre-industrial ages, and was still up until the 80s a fear in parts of the world. It may well come back because obviously it depends on all sorts of things. It does depend on natural disasters. It depends on civil conflicts and all that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, as a natural phenomenon, we have enough food for the first time ever. I would suggest in the history of civilization, we have enough food to actually feed the population, and that is down to hydrocarbons, primarily down to hydrocarbons. It's down to the fact that we have increased CO2. I was interested, by the way, in a recent paper from the CO2 Coalition that did accept that we have led to the increase in CO2 because there are a number of theories, again, isotopes and all that sort of stuff, that suggests that much of it is natural. And there's obviously all the theory that as the world warms naturally, CO2 is released from the oceans, and that has contributed quite a lot. I'm still not, as I say, I'm a student of science. I don't simply, like I say, I don't know enough. I don't think anybody really knows enough to precisely point out why CO2 has increased, but the CO2 Coalition accept that we as humans have probably increased it. And I think that's a reasonable thing to say. But they point out that it's been wholly beneficial because, of course, we've increased it from 280 parts per million before the industrial age to about 420 now. And we all know that if it goes down to 180, 150, all life on Earth will die because plants will not survive. We also know that plants have developed in the past to take in much higher levels of CO2, up to 1,000, 1,200. And so we know that plants, this is why we've seen the greening, because you see more CO2. And of course, you then have the theory that, first of all, carbon dioxide itself will saturate and it will not cause undue warming. And the warming that it has caused has actually been mostly beneficial. And we know that, but what it will do is it will cause, a huge increase in plant growth, which will be very, very good for the people who live on this earth. Yeah.
I want to throw in one thing here. You mentioned the collapse of net zero around the world. I think this is great news here about the collapse of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Just in recent days, banks keep withdrawing from it. So Citigroup withdrew, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, Wells Fargo, and Goldman Sachs all left. I think that's great news. But I was going to ask you, do you think that Germany and the UK can be holdouts for much longer and it's going to collapse everywhere else, but they're going to stick with it? Or what's going to happen in the UK, do you think, in the next 5 years? Over net zero.
I don't think they can hold out. No, I don't think they can. I mean, this government, I've never seen a Labour government like it. I mean, we've had unpopular governments before. But Keir Starmer is probably the worst prime minister we ever had. And believe you me, if you've been around in this country as long as I am, that's a fairly low bar. But he's probably the worst prime minister we've had. His approval ratings are through the floor, and much of it is due to what they're doing. Unfortunately, we have this guy Ed Miliband on Talk Radio, or Talk, what it's called these days, a radio station here. I'm known as the unofficial Mad Miliband correspondent, because whenever they want anyone to talk about the Mad Miliband, I sometimes get a call, you see. And he's generally known as the Mad Miliband, which it's not just an insult; it's just his real name. Just not. Anyway, leave aside the Mad Miliband. Yes, so you have at the moment in the hands of zealots. The Labour government at the moment is spending money like crazy. It's taxing people like crazy. The pips are starting to squeak. You're starting to see economic growth go down. You're starting to see interest rates go up. You're starting to see the national debt rise. And eventually what happens is that, we're a relatively small country, and we have to obey what international bond markets, what international financiers want. If they stop lending us money, then we have to sort of, make adjustments. There are outside forces working on them. Now you're faced with something like net zero. If you're in the Treasury the finance department, you're suddenly faced with a man Milbank coming in and saying, "Oh, today I want 22 billion for carbon capture." And then some bloke says, "Yeah, but carbon capture, that's been around for 50 years and no one's ever really got it to work, have they?" No, no, we want it. No, it's very important. We want it for, don't interrupt. We want, as I say, money for the all the people who live on island sandbanks in the South Pacific, and we want money for, educating people. We want to change the curriculum. We want, there's an unlimited pot. We want money and in order for wind farms, which don't make any economic sense at all, because nobody would put up a wind farm if they had to sell the electricity in the open market. We have to give them vast amounts of money and subsidies and all sorts of things. We have to pay them to turn them on, then we have to pay them to turn them off, and then we have to pay them. God knows, we have to pay them all the time. But whatever it is, it's, as I said before, it's billions and billions of pounds. And eventually, the Labour government is busy. First thing it did when it came to power, it's not really a working class party anymore. It's more an anti-working class party, but it is still in hock to the monopoly state unions. And the first thing it did was paid them all off, gave them huge pay rises. So that took, billions out of the treasury as well. They probably have to do it this year because they gave, all the train drivers who've been sort of striking on and off for about 3 years during the last Conservative government, they paid them off on day one. And I noticed recently they've started striking again. Of course, they have this year because they want more money. And they walked out at New Year because they walked out of one dispute because it was snowing and it was apparently dangerous to walk to the train on snow. So we're back to those of us who lived in the 1970s and a similar Labour government. We're back to all the nonsense that we, put up with. So there are huge demands. What I'm saying, there are huge demands on the finances in Britain, and net zero is one of the biggest. And I suspect that once once things start to collapse, once they really get their feet under the table and realise what they've done, I think net zero will have to go. You see, they're destroying the car industry. We just had the figures for 2024 for electric vehicles. Now, they sold 19.6% of the total vehicles sold in the UK were electric. Now, most of those went to fleet. Most of them have been practically, huge subsidies are being given by manufacturers. And the reason is that last year they had to sell 22% of all their vehicles mandated under this, the net zero legislative requirements gone through the UK Parliament. Last year they had to sell 22% under this taper that goes up to 2030 when you will not be able to buy a new petrol or gas and diesel car. So last year they sold 19.7. So they got, for everyone they sold, they didn't sell, instead of a petrol car, they had to pay a £15,000 fine. Now that adds up to a phenomenal amount of money, for major major car manufacturers. It's great for Tesla, who just sell electric cars, and they've now got £600 million of credits that they can sell to people like Ford and whatever. So they're okay. And one or two others that sort of predominantly electric are going to make a fortune. Oh, there are two Chinese manufacturers. Polaris is one, I think it's called. They're going to make about 200 million. So all of our indigenous manufacturers, who've got sort of, car manufacturing plants in industrial areas, low opportunities, low jobs, they're all going to be forking out a huge amount. That taper goes up to 28% this year. So they barely sold 20% this year, and they did it. And if you look at the figures, you'll see that in December there were all sorts of fudging going on. They pre-registered a whole load of electric ones and all sorts of things, and depressed the sale of petrol. This year they've got to do 28%, and then next year it gets more and more. These already we've lost the Vauxhall plant in Luton, which was a van plant. We lost some time ago Honda, or in Swindon, and all of our car manufacturers will simply have to close. They will simply have to close. If you carry on like this, they will all close. You will lose your industrial base. In Port Talbot, which was a great centre of steel making, I went to college, I know it well. I went to college next door in Swansea. And Port Talbot was a major industrial centre, chemicals, steel, near the coalfields, obviously, in those days of South Wales. Last of the steel making is now closed. The last blast furnace is closed. And they say they're going to put an electric one in, which will only produce scrap. You'll basically be melting down scrap metal, which doesn't produce the grade steel that you need, say, to produce unimportant things like battleships and tanks and, things that you might, think are useful, for your own national defense, in case, Boris the Bear gets a bit frisky and whatever, So, 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 so everywhere you look, these lunatics are destroying our industrial base. I would say there's certainly an activist cell, but I think it's endemic in the Met Office. It's endemic in, as we know, academia, science, journalism. And the problem is that you don't make a living unless you're part of it. You don't make a living unless you believe in the net zero narrative. But certainly what I see from the Met Office, I'll give you another example. There's a chap called Professor Richard Betts, who's the head of climate impacts. And Richard Betts came up with this recent wheeze where he wanted to prove that we got over 1.5 centigrade, which is this guardrail, this they invented, for net zero over at the IPC and all those people. He wanted a definitive say when we gone past 1.5. The problem is that we did have a couple of 0.2 spike recently, and so they're all saying, "Oh, we got to it. We've hit it 1 year." But the trouble is, we've hit it before. But unfortunately, we can't pull the wool over people's eyes. We all know that climate is a trend, and you measure this thing over 20, 30 years. So 1 year doesn't count. It's it was an outlier, and you just need a little bit of maths to explain it away, and accurately explain it away. But they want to have this 1.5 figure as soon as possible, because if they can have it, then, as he said in his paper where he was discussing it, well, we can push for more basically climate policies. So he invented this idea. It was in the paper first, and I noticed it's now on the website of the Met Office, along with all their other temperature data. And it's what they do is they get to 1.5, or they get to what they say is the trend at the moment. They take 10 years of past data. Well, we know if you're taking 10 years of Met Office data and HACRUP data, well, okay, leaving that aside, but there are doubts about that to an extent, which we've got into. And then you take 10 years of data from computer models, forecasts, and you put the two together and you say the magic words, presumably abracadabra, tap it with a stick, and there you are. You've got, the figure that you want, 1.5 or 1.4 or whatever, And this was seriously done. And we wrote about this. It was last December, I think, or December 4 last. And we wrote about it in Daily Sceptic, and took a rather sort of a view that I've just explained, a similar view. And he tweeted that first of all he complained, why are they taking 3 weeks to review my paper? He said perhaps the lads at or whatever he said at the Daily Sceptic have had to be told, or perhaps the kids, the 5-year-old kids or something at the Daily Sceptic have had to be told what a temperature is. And I think such is the arrogance of a lot of these people. They think they can get away with just that sort of abuse. I mean, well, of course we know what a temperature is, but I do wonder if Professor Betts knows how to measure a temperature. I mean, I'm sure he knows what a temperature is as well. And it was just it struck me as just the arrogance that there's no wish to engage in people who criticize their work. They're professors. They're from the Met Office. Their word comes from on high, and ex cathedra, they're infallible, like the Roman Pope on matters of dogma, and so we have this. And I noticed, as I say, recently, that it's now part of the Met Office reporting. You can now read this figure. I think it's about 1.35 or something. I forget now. I mean, it's just a made-up figure. I mean, it's just a made-up figure. Let's be honest about it, Richard. It's made up. It's a political made-up figure. And when you see that going on, your goodwill to the Met Office, which, as I say, is still there. It's an admirable organization, in many ways. It does seem to think, what are they doing? Is there an activist cell? Is there a deliberate attempt to use scientific data, which in many cases has been hard won over 150 years, scientific data that, a lot of very good, dedicated scientists have produced? Is there now an attempt to use that data to use techniques that, in my view, and in the view of a lot of people, don't really pass muster as far as actually producing accurate scientific data, to use this in order to persuade populations that there is this massive problem of massive increases in heat? It's one of those conspiracy theories operating in full sight. They don't make any secret of it. And if you read the climate fact check, which is essentially just a long ramble from the Met Office, you'll see all of the way that they have tried to justify their entire database, from the invented stations to the World Meteorological Organization data and all this sort of thing. They actually, just going back to Met Office, I remember one thing. We did another Freedom of Information Act, and we found out that the reason that the Met Office say they don't go along with the WMO, or they use data from WMO, is they have their own in-house assessment methods, which is, sort of a bit like marking your own homework. So we then got a Freedom of Information Act, and we asked them for the details of that. And they rank their stations by excellent, good, satisfactory, and unsatisfactory. And you'll be surprised not to learn that 90% of their websites are in excellent, good, and satisfactory, and only about I think it's 10%, it's under 10% are in unsatisfactory. Again, I think the figure is there's about 27 stations, and again we were able to find out which they were. And then on the climate feedback site, which they published, disputing what we've been writing, they said that that if it was a station was unsatisfactory, that they would either close it or they would not use the data for records. So we went to look at the 4 national records set in the United Kingdom: England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Northern Ireland. And we found that Harwarden Airport, which used to be a military base, still an airport, holds the record for the highest temperature in Wales. I think it was 37.1 degrees centigrade, set a year or so ago. I think it was set in 2022. Kelso-Breeze, Arwidium is on the unsatisfactory list. It should have been either closed or, according to the Met, according to what the climate feedback said, it should not be used for reporting purposes. And yet there it is. There it is. So, I can only point out, what they're doing. And I know Anthony Watts in the States has done similar, that, you can only report, we know enough about their methods to take a decision on why it's been well, certainly on the validity of it, how rigorous their methods are, how much reliance we can put on these sorts of constant records they're producing, and the trend of the data. We can make a decision on that. Now, whether we then jump to say that it's riddled with, this band of net zero fanatics, well, I mean, I suppose you could argue a band is a collection of people, and they are net zero fanatics. So, who knows? Who knows?
So there was also this deal about they claimed that they had airport data that went back to 1873 when the Wright brothers flew in 1903, and they just happened to put it in the right spot. They predicted where the airport was going to be. But anyway, it was totally made up again that time, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, well, this comes from the "you can't make it up" school of journalism, but but we don't have to go along with that, because we just look at the Met Office. Yes, the Stornoway Airport record goes back to 1873, and as I say, this was powered flight. The Wright brothers, I think, was 1903. So they were either very prescient in their forecasting and setting up an airport 40 years before, or perhaps it was, perhaps there was an extensive ballooning airport of some sort, or perhaps it was just, I think they had gliders the first anyway. But obviously, no, it isn't. Again, this was Mr. Sanders' story, one of his excellent stories, and he found. But you see, the thing is that if you go back to the record, where people, judged it, was they produced the same coordinates and said it had been there since 1873. Now, obviously, it had either been moved, or they built the airport on the site where the temperature measurement station was. In fact, Sanders found it was actually 4 kilometers away in a place called, I think, Lewes Castle. It was in a castle garden, and it was moved to the airport it's only a very small airport, because it's one of the Western Isles. It was moved, I think, in 1967 or something like that. And the two data sets were spliced together. And there's, because it actually did go viral, that story, because it is quite a funny story, really. It was not, I mean, this is why I'm studying journalism, because when you can write stories about, people sort of, starting up airports and measuring data, before the Wright brothers even, were even born, probably, I don't know. Anyway, so yes, they'd splice them together, but they don't disclose it. And this is what they're doing all the time. They're taking data. You don't know where they're taking data from. They're merging it. They could be 2 totally different sites. And in fact, they were. They were quite a distance apart. And if they just said that, if you go to the actual page, which you can look up the page for all of the years, the records for the years going back to 1873. If they just put at the top the coordinates, instead of just putting the current ones, they put all of the coordinates for all of the sites and made it clear that this was. But they don't even call it Stornoway. They call it Stornoway Airport. So again, it suggests that it's from the airport. I guess they're doing it because they want it to appear as if, they are merging, they're homogenizing, they're adjusting, they're doing all these sorts of things. This is the point that Ray Sanders made. They're doing all these things, but I think they don't want us to sort of quite know to the extent that they're doing it. So it's easier for them just to, make general suggestions. And it's become so bad, it's become so shoddy and so clumsy that they're producing data on non-existent stations. And you really need someone to go into that site and clean it up. I mean, really go through it with a fine-tooth comb and say, look, what are we doing here? What are we trying to achieve with it? What are we doing? Should we perhaps use the 27 or the class 2 ones? Should we use that as a basis for a pristine site that will give us the data we need in order to tell people accurately what the temperature is, as far as one can measure it in the United Kingdom? If you're going to do that, fine, set that up, but don't use this site that's full of all sorts of I've been into it. I mean, we've been talking about it, full of all this junks, stations. I mean, and don't try and pull the wool over our eyes and say that this year was 0.06 warmer or cooler than the year before.
So is it the case that in the US they are doing that? They've set up a new network of high quality stations? I thought didn't you say that earlier just now? Or,
yeah, they have. Yes, they've been doing it since 2005, haven't they? And I think it's 147, and they're in absolute pristine sites. It's across the United States, and it produces. It certainly produces lower trends than the big one that they normally use. It does produce less warming. You see, Ray is doing something. I did actually, one of the boxes, the Pandora's box that I referred to earlier. One thing that I thought might fly out was that, well, actually, if you go to those 27 sites, or say the 50 or so that are class 1 and class 2, and you look at the data and you compare it to the records from class 5, you can see whether there is a difference. I did actually give a Freedom of Information Act request to the Met Office saying, have you got the average temperature going back to whatever, say 50 years, 60 years, the class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4? Well, they say they didn't have it, which is fair enough. They might not have it. And Freedom of Information Acts only really work when they got data immediately to hand. If you ask someone to do something that requires quite a bit of work, they can usually turn it down. So they say they haven't got it, and fair enough, we accept them at their word. But if you're going to do it, but the problem, and you can look at monthly data, and I started looking at it, but the problem that you got is that the United Kingdom goes from, is it 52 north to 60, 61 north? You've got quite a variation in latitude. Scotland is much colder than England, and the north of England is colder than the south of England. And Wales, again, is another sort of a particular climate. And then you've got Northern Ireland, which is only part of Ireland, and obviously the north. So if you're going to do that, you're going to have to sort of make some provision for geographical spread. And there aren't really enough stations, I would think, to do that. I think a lot of the class 1s are in Scotland, for instance, because there are wider open spaces and there's less urbanization, say in the Highlands. I don't completely know. I mean, I haven't really looked in great detail exactly where they are. I know them by name, but I assume they are. And that would skew it towards lower temperatures, naturally, because it's at a higher latitude. So I think there are problems in doing that. But if you could get, and I think Ray is looking, again, you would need sort of spreadsheets, and because I think you can get daily temperatures for a lot of this stuff. If you can get a geographical spread, but then again, you've got to say, well, it's geographical, but how? Now trying to think of other sort of corrupted influences. Obviously, if they're all class 2 and 1 and class 2, there's no problem with nearby compromises. But then, are they in valleys? Are they on top of hills? Maybe you have to sort of also work in elevations and this sort of thing. So it would be difficult, but it would be an interesting exercise. If somebody wants to do a PhD and wants to devote 3 years of painstaking research and work out all sorts of wonderful ways to homogenize and account for all the variations, and then come to a figure, that would be a very, very good PhD. You wouldn't get any funding for it, of course. Because if you told someone, "Oh, I want to see if if you told them what your idea was," I don't think you get very much funding at all. You certainly wouldn't get it from the University of Exeter, which is highly connected to the Met Office, where I think Professor Richard Betts plies his trade, his daytime job. We found another retraction of a science paper. These retractions are very interesting. Again, I do take credit for the Alamonte retraction. Or rather, I don't take credit for the retraction. I take credit for the fact that it eventually happened, because these are four Italian physicists who produced a paper. I don't know if you know the story, Alamonte et al. And they produced a paper. They used mostly data from the IPCC and general data that's freely available. And they found that, as often other papers have done, that trends in bad weather, extreme weather, have not got worse in the last 100 years. I mean, even the IPCC says that it can see no sign of human involvement in almost all natural variation disasters of weather. And they found that there was therefore no justice for a climate emergency. And this was up and about for a year. We then came across it. We wrote about it, and it went viral. Sometimes on the Daily Sceptic, we put it on Twitter, social media. Huge response. Huge numbers of people. It reposted. It generally got a wider audience. I think the Australian Broadcasting Corporation picked it up. There were one, two other papers. It became known, and it was reported on because it was an interesting, conclusion they come to. And so what happened about 6 months later? It was retracted, and I forget who it was. It was either Nature or Science. It was one of the major publishers. And what happened was that an unholy alliance of Michael Mann, a chap from The Guardian, Dr. Frederica Otto, who does all this weather attribution alchemy, weather attribution, weather, whatever they call it. There were two or three others as well. I think jumped on. Oh, the chap from the Associated French Presse, Marlowe Hood, the self-styled herald of the Anthropocene. They all jumped on it, and they got them to retract it. And they said that it was all junk science, and that the publisher sent it out for extra review, and it was retracted. I mean, it was unbelievable. I mean, the paper itself was a perfectly reasoned paper written by, I think, three of the people. People were professors, professors of physics, no less. Not necessarily heralds of the Anthropocene, journalists and workers on The Guardian. And so it was retracted, and it's a big scandal. Alamonte et al. Well, we wrote a piece about, I think it was 3 months ago, and I've written before about the saturation of CO2. And we quoted a Polish professor, Dr. Kubicki, I think his name was, and he talked about saturation. The CO2 is now at such a level that no more warming is possible. He actually sort of came down really, it's nothing. The story was actually about two other groups of scientists. There was a group of Taiwanese scientists, a group of Austrian scientists, and they produced numbers for this doubling of CO2. 0.3 centigrade, 0.5, I think it was, at these lower ends, margin of error ends, really. But we did sort of reference Kubicki, who'd written, I think, 2 other papers recently about it. Again, they were in one of the major publishers, and I published it. I published something else recently where I sourced it, and my editor phoned up and said, "Chris," he said, "that paper you sourced, it's been retracted," and it's been retracted. And I, again, that the original story did go viral. It did get quite a following. It got reprinted, and I think it was in WhatsApp with that and all sorts of things, reposted. And yeah, it's been retracted. Now, I'm still working on that. I'm trying to get hold of Dr. Kubicki. It's been difficult over the holiday period. The only explanation, they don't give any explanation, because normally they do give an explanation. They just said that it didn't reach our standards, we've had it peer reviewed. But I'd read that paper. It was a regular paper that basically went into the saturation theory and came to a conclusion that many scientists have now come to, that the number that they look at, the climate sensitivity number, is actually quite low, mainly because it is saturated. It's been retracted. It's been retracted. I mean, this goes on all the time. Now, I don't know whether it's been retracted because we gave it publicity and it did get a bit of an audience, or whether there's a genuine scientific reason. I don't know, but it does seem to happen, increasingly so. And then we'll put it aside with all the people who then say you will not get this stuff published. If you take any sort of skeptical view, you have to sort of disguise it in science papers. Why I've become such an avid reader of science papers is I don't really read the abstracts anymore, because they don't really say what they mean. Because if they're going to be at all skeptical, it's all in the body of the work, so they have to sort of hide it so they get published. There was that chap recently, I think we wrote about a year ago, who wrote a paper where he overemphasized the human causes of wildfires in, I think, Western America somewhere. And he left academia straight after, and he obviously knew he was going to do that, and he blew the whistle on. He said, well, the only reason I wrote that is it didn't get published otherwise. He said, if I told the truth, and the truth was that there's been no increase in wildfires in the last 40 years, he said, no, they wouldn't touch it. So it goes on. So yes, that's the only thing that I've that sort of interested me. Well, not the only thing, but that sort of tickled my fancy. That yet another retraction. This is really not good, isn't it? I mean, just to finally, this is terrible. I mean, to have, I went to university 50 years ago. It was a wonderful place to be. All these ideas, you could say what you liked. You could have, huge arguments as long as you could back it up. And then, you go for a drink afterwards and slap everybody on the back. And it was all, it was a real open ideas. You could discuss anything. It's just changed. It's just changed. And let's hope that even in the unlikely savior of Donald Trump, the Donald, let's hope that the influence he has in America, which will hopefully stretch to the rest of the free world, will be such that we will get rid of a lot of this fact-checking, retraction, this lying by omission, this journalism by narrative, this refusal to discuss anything that doesn't, as I say, follow a narrative, all in the cause, as I say, in the case of the climate science, a net zero death cult, because that's what it is. Because people will eventually not survive if we go down the net zero route.
All right, Chris Morrison, thanks a lot for all you're doing. You're a very interesting guy, and keep it up. Appreciate it.
Thanks.